Today, we are welcomed by a very special guest, the author of a 2021 hit, Damascus Station. And I just finished it, and it's already the best book that I have read this year. I'm sorry it took me this long, but thanks for joining us, David McCloskey.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
I mean it. This book, I don't know why it took me this long, but it swept me off my feet. I was so invested with these characters and this plot and this setting, the way you transported me to Syria. So just talk to me. How did you come to write this book after having a career in the CIA? Did you know writing a story about your experience was something you always wanted to do?
I mean, honestly, no. I, I left the agency in 2014. I had worked on Syria for most of my time there, and so that was obviously top of mind for me. Like it was coming on in the middle of, but for me on the heels of this experience working on a really pretty, extremely violent, extremely upsetting civil war that had ripped the whole country apart. And for me, this book was really, it at least started, I think, as an attempt to kind of process a lot of that. I had lived in Damascus. I had worked on it for, at that point, 7 years. And I just felt very emotionally tied to the place. And so the very first drafts of what became this book, were really almost like journal entries, I think, to some degree, like processing things, writing down stories, kind of some of which were true, some of which were kind of fictional, like just kind of writing short stories about it. And, I ended up putting that aside and taking another job, leaving intelligence, leaving DC. And I had really enjoyed the experience of that writing and found that I was really in the flow while I was doing it. 8 or 9 hours would just pass by like that. And I kind of thought, well, that's interesting. There's something about that, but I had no idea what would come of it. And I honestly, once I took another job and kind of got into a new life, I thought, well, it's just going to be one of those things that lives on my computer. It's a Word document I've got that's this fun processing of an experience that'll never go anywhere. But when I actually had the opportunity to sit back down with it 5 years later, it became a much more focused exercise, I think, aided by the benefit of it being 5 years later and there being a bit less emotion around it. It felt a bit less raw to say, okay, can I get the CIA right? Can I tell a true fictional story, right, about the CIA and what it is and what it does and what it feels like to work there? And can I tell a real story about Syria? And to me, those two kind of things they were the guiding light of the book. And taking the manuscript from 2014, which was objectively terrible and no one would want to read, and turning that into something that was both satisfying to me and exciting to me to write, and then also something that you would want to read, that actually had a plot and interesting characters,
Right.
And moved you toward some kind of conclusion as opposed to just spinning, in the ether. So the book really came out of that journey and that transformation, and yeah, it was very much fueled by my my desire to tell those stories, accurately and to bring people into those worlds.
That realism and striking the balance between what's, one, going to be allowed to be published, and two, a
Right.
little close to home, but also blending that with it being a fictional story that you ultimately are creating, and it is imaginative at the same time. From an outsider's perspective, with no experience anywhere in the realm of intelligence in your world, it seemed so real. Like,
Yeah.
how did you want to translate your experience in the field, both at Langley, get that in the book, but balance that with you're still telling a story that's fake, but you would never know. It almost reads as if it could be a history of the Syrian conflict.
Yeah. I as I wrote, I realized that a lot of things that were true, or at least close enough to true, either from a CIA culture standpoint, or from a tradecraft standpoint, or from a serious standpoint. Like, it just struck me that they were more interesting than things that I would make up. And there are points in the narrative where you do have to bend that reality to make the story work, to make the plot work. Like, it can't just be a tradecraft manual. It can't just be a history of the war. It can't just be a nonfiction book about the CIA, right? It's not any of those things, but I wanted it to feel close enough to those things, and I felt like I could bring in a lot of real rich detail about, the CIA, like the really cool tradecraft, but also just, the mind-numbing bureaucracy and the procedure and the sort of, the procedural aspect of it. And I could bring in the reality of the Syrian war, and like all of that would be more interesting than anything I could make up if I knew kind of where to break the rules, which sounds a little bit weird, but I knew that I wanted to create a kind of baseline of verisimilitude and authenticity, and then at select points break it, so that the story would work. But I hoped that as the reader, you'd feel so drawn into the world that you wouldn't, you wouldn't even care, or maybe you wouldn't even notice when I stepped from the world of, real tradecraft to something that's made up, or from the real Syria to something that's a little bit bent. I was hoping that the foundation would be laid so that you'd say, okay, I'm going along with this, or maybe I don't even know that I've transitioned to something that's made up,
Oh, you 100% nailed that. I was salivating over some of these details on the surveillance detection routes, which we definitely want to talk about. You really go into detail on those, and maybe we should save some of it for our spoiler section in case some listeners don't know.
Yeah.
The second half of this podcast, we will give you a spoiler warning. David is kind enough to stay on with us and go into the details of the plot. So if you read the book and finished it, we'll talk about the characters, some of the really awesome action sequences, some of that tradecraft and espionage. So just in a general sense, you spend a lot of time on the page with these surveillance detection routes. And I've read a few things about, training down in Williamsburg and whatnot. And I read the book, I believe it was TJ Waters, Class 11, and his account of his time training at the farm as one of the first post 9/11 recruit classes.
Yeah.
And he also talks a whole lot about the training and the surveillance route. So why did you decide to make that a focal point of the story and what Sam and the other main characters do? Is that because it is so central to an operative's craft?
Yeah. I mean, to take one step back from that question before answering it, I thought,
Sure.
As I went into the book, like I said, that the kind of overall theme was, hey, like, can I get the CIA right, or at least close enough to right, and part of that is getting the tradecraft kind of right, or at least, enough so that it feels real, and it's obviously not betraying anything that's overly sensitive. And I've been pretty much a lifetime or lifelong reader of spy fiction, and I've kind of been struck that a lot of it, particularly the American varietal, is really more about people who work in sort of special operations and maybe have a CIA tag, and a lot of that stuff, it's really fun, and I read almost all of it, but it really bears little resemblance to the life of an actual CIA case officer. As I, had spent time with CIA case officers, as I, was actually there myself as an analyst, like, you kind of realize that this is a very different craft. I mean, they're doing something that's very different from what you read about in a Vince Flynn novel, or in a Brad Thor novel, or in a Jack Carr novel. And those guys, God bless them, those are wonderful. I read every single one of those books. They're not trying to do that stuff, but it's not what a normal CIA case officer does, right? And I've just been struck that I think what an actual CIA case officer does is pretty damn interesting. And so when I thought about that toolkit and like what they're doing day to day, especially when you think about Damascus 10 years ago, this denied environment, where you have this, antagonistic government, hostile relationship, blanket of surveillance, like what a case officer who is in like a case officer stationed to Damascus, like that's what they're going to be doing and thinking about all the time is how do I create space so that I can conduct the operational acts. I can meet with the asset, I can do the brush pass, whatever it might be. And so that's why I spent so much time on it, because Sam Joseph, the one of the protagonists of this book, is a CIA case officer who's in Damascus, in 2011, 2012, around there, and that is what his life would be. And so I spent a lot of time on it because, like, as he's practicing his trade, that's what he's going to be doing. As sort of weird as it might be, I mean, he's going to be thinking about the street, he's going to be feeling the place, he's going to be thinking about his physical environment in a way that like none of us actually think about our physical environment day to day, because he's going to be thinking about where can I and how can I meet with an asset, do this foot placement, drop this cash, whatever it might be. Like that's how he's going to think about the world. And so I wanted to kind of bring the reader into that.
Yeah, that's really good. And since you mentioned it, some of these authors, we obviously are the Thriller podcast, very heavy on the authors you just named. We have 100+ episodes about the Mitch Rapp series. We read every book.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, yeah. It's fantastic, right?
We love them. Like, huge fans.
Yeah.
But you're right in saying that sometimes that genre pigeonholes itself, leaves you a little short of what are other roles outside of the paramilitary or the special operations group people, the former SEALs and Rangers that they bring in. There's so much more that's actually more important on the intelligence side of things. So we almost thirst for a book like yours, which has meat, which has the real world connections, where some of the Flynn and Thor books take us out of reality a little too much sometimes. They get a lot of the geopolitics, I think, right, and the big picture.
Oh, for sure. Yeah,
but
for sure.
But Sam running an agent in Damascus, around 2010, that gives us a whole nother type of hero. And Sam doesn't just kick ass and take names. He is much more deliberate and analytical and reserved and careful. And it's more a psychological thriller in some sense about the relationships between people. Would you say it's not quite just a thriller? It's not just an espionage book. It's not just an action drama. It's almost crossing genres and really touching on a lot of different varieties.
Look, I wanted it to feel, I wanted there to be action at points that sort of moved the narrative forward, and I wanted fans of all of the authors you just mentioned to read it and to feel like this is something that they could relate to in some way and kind of like they would enjoy, right? And I think I wanted people who had read Flynn books and Thor books and the Jack Carr books to be able to pick this up and say, hey, this is really cool. This is different. It's cool. I like it. I want to read it too. But it is, I think, by virtue of, the type of character that Sam is, and just frankly, the type of book that I wanted to write, like it is probably a little bit more, it is less driven by the action.
Right.
And I don't mean that in a pejorative way at all, right? It's just, it's less driven by the action, and it's more driven by the kind of intrigue of the espionage and the relationships between the characters at times. I think that is the kind of book that I spoke with Jack Carr when I was writing this book. We've been in touch, and I was struck by something he said, and we were just having a conversation about writing, and he was like, look, I wrote a book for my nightstand. Like, this was a book that I wrote a book that I wanted on my nightstand. And I think that's wonderful advice. Like, I wrote a book that, this is the kind of book that I would want to read, right. And so I wrote a book that I would want on my nightstand. Simple as that.
Yeah. And all that, it just made me think your book is much closer to a Le Carre, and Sam is almost a modern, the way Flynn and Thor are like modern day Clancy's or more updated Clancy's in a post like 9/11 and that those kind of plot lines. I feel like you're taking his Cold War kind of storylines with George Smiley and the George Smiley character, and yours is almost bringing that to a modern era and putting a spin on it in the 2010s. Would you say you did you lean on Le Carre? Are you a fan? Because it kind of got vibes of The Spy Who Came in from the Cold with some of the things you did.
Well, I would never want to compare myself to him because I think he sort of transcends the genre in that he is a world class novelist who just happened to write about spies in some ways, right? Like, but I've read I think everything that he's written, and have been reading it for the past you know 17, 18 years. I mean, really since I started to get into the genre. So, I think he is undoubtedly some kind of influence, although I couldn't exactly tell you how. I do think I appreciate the kind of, this is maybe a little bit simplistic, but kind of the British school of espionage fiction, which tends to be a little bit more slow burn. Like, if I think about him, one of my, probably my favorite Le Carre novel is Little Drummer Girl,
Okay.
which I think does a wonderful job of kind of showing the buildup of a pretty complicated, human operation, and then at the same time deals really in this very intricate, multi-layered way with the like manipulative, intimate relationship between a case officer and their asset. I like that book a lot, and I
Right.
think that that book influenced me in how I thought about the Sam and Miriam relationship in Damascus Station, and the idea that like you could have a book that's really interesting that's not driven by exclusively by explosives and shooting and things
Yeah.
like that, but that there is a lot of this kind of intrigue, some of which is psychological, some of which is just driven by the trade craft, which is not violent all the time, or most of the time, and that could propel a plot. That to me was kind of an eye-opening realization, I think, as I kind of went back to some Le Carre's stuff over the past 3 or 4 years and studied it a little bit more analytically. Because when I'd read it as a teenager, it was like, well, this is interesting, but I wasn't thinking about how he put it together or what moved the story forward. You're just kind
Mhm.
of appreciating it. Now it's kind of like, okay, well, this guy's got whole chapters where quote unquote nothing happens, but like there's a lot of character development, or
It's
there's
world building.
intrigue building, yeah, and that's interesting, right? So I think that school of espionage fiction to me is probably like closer to my the voice or kind of the world that I want to create.
100%. You could see those influences on the page. It all comes through and it's just masterfully, masterfully done. So
Thank
you
you.
mentioned something I'm burning to ask you. So I am going to drop a spoiler warning here. We're going to get
Yep.
into some of the nitty gritty and the actual characters in the book and the plot of what happens. So pause right now if you haven't read it. Pick up Damascus Station. Fantastic book. Like I said, best that I've read so far in 2022. There's a lot to come, but I definitely think it'll hold up. Really loved it. So, with a spoiler warning, I want to ask Sam and Mariam. I'm shipping it. They the way they fell for each other, and I always wondered what is the personal relationship between a case officer and an agent? Does it ever get too physical, too emotional, or is it pure professionalism? Like, why did you want them to fall in love so deeply for each other, knowing it's kind of taboo?
Yeah. Well, it's more than kind of taboo. It's the kind of thing that gets you fired. And
Right.
like the it doesn't, I mean, the reality of it is that there are examples of it happening, but
Hmm.
almost every single case officer asset relationship is marked by professionalism and not by the kind of romantic draw that I discuss in a kind of treat in Damascus Station. So I think the caveat here is that this is something that I sort of dove into in the world of fiction. It's not without some kind of precedent, but at the same time, like, no one reading this book should think that this is some kind of common occurrence, although it's obviously a common or somewhat common trope, I think, in espionage fiction to kind of deal with this. Now, the reason why I was so drawn to it, and really why I became more drawn to it, is I wrote the book because initially their relationship was something that wasn't as sort of full throated as it became
Okay.
in the course of the novel. Like, I actually found that the characters themselves had an energy that drew them together, and that created its own its own sort of spark and drove the plot. But I was drawn to it intellectually because if you sort of take the case officer asset relationship and you strip the romantic stuff out for a second, you put that to the side, you have this really interesting relationship, right? You have an intimate relationship, one where there's really mutual vulnerability. You're talking about being in a country like Syria. Miriam could tell the Syrians that Sam is CIA, and he could get kicked out of Syria or much worse. He knows her darkest secret, right? Like, you're sort of dealing in this world of two people who have a quote unquote professional relationship, but it's deeply intimate, really. You have this weird manipulation that's existing somewhat unsaid, over the top of it, where the case officer is manipulating this person to get information. And then I thought, look, if you inject romantic interest into this, like, as a novelist, I mean, you have a lot of potential energy there. A lot of different ways you can go, a lot of things that can move plot forward, that can put your characters in interesting situations. And honestly, I didn't have the whole thing kind of scoped out in my head when I started.
Mm.
But as I worked with that, I realized that there was a lot there. And it was just like, okay, well, let's figure out where this is going to go, because it's fun, and there's a lot of different, you can put people in really tense personal situations, sexual situations, professional situations. And there's not a lot of, like, in your writing, like, sometimes things can be kind of wooden and stale, and it's like, hey, this doesn't really work. Like, this was an example of, like, wow, there's a lot of heat here, there's a lot of energy here, I'm just going to drive forward. So that's why I was really drawn to this setup.
And that happens when Mariam almost sells out Sam, but because they took Razan,
Yeah,
her cousin she loves dearly, and in her mind she feels so bad about it, but she was also thinking what she could safely give up to the
yeah,
Syrians and what she should withhold, and so she doesn't give them everything, but she gives
yeah,
them enough to interest them, but she's really trying to protect Sam in her relationship the whole time. Like, she gives them the device, but doesn't show them how to
yeah.
swipe on it, and different things. Let me ask you about that. You bring in some really neat details, whether it's the device with this blast message system that's undetectable, where you swipe in one pattern to do it secretly, and you put in your regular passcode to access all the normal stuff. Is that tech you're kind of inventing, or is that something that that's out there?
uh, Let me put it this way:
Or
there's
can
a
you say?
foundation. There's a foundation of realism there, but a lot of the details are made up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're made up by virtue of just, it's not like, I can't. It would be completely irresponsible of me to actually, like, describe how an actual device, that exists today works. So it's there's a foundation of realism, but then embellishment,
Right.
on top of it, as unsatisfying as that might be to say.
And we also had, in that vein, the necklace camera, which was real
Yeah,
interesting, and the briefcase. And the
yeah.
briefcase made me think of something out of The Americans. I don't know if you're a fan, so I'd love to hear your take. Have you
Oh, I'm a
seen that
huge
show?
fan.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
I love the Americans. Yeah,
I feel
love it.
like, and I'd love to hear from you, does that show get it right? I feel like it does, because there's a similar briefcase thing where they put in a false bottom, and
Yeah.
they got a mic in it. Do you like that show? Is that real?
No, I love it. I love it. And I mean, it's obviously that show is also, I actually think what Joe Weisberg was doing was something a little bit similar to my philosophy, which is like there's enough that's real there
Right.
that gives you this foundation of like, oh, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. The street trade craft in that show is pretty good.
Oh yeah.
A lot of the gadgetry is pretty good and based off of actual KGB stuff from the 70s and 80s. But when you look at the kind of arc of it and a lot of the different things they're doing, it is like pretty over the top. You
But
know,
you can forgive that because you know
but
it's
you
based in
forgive it.
realism.
You forgive it
Exactly.
100%.
Yeah.
And I used to, when I was at the agency, like I would get hung up on the realism of these kind of things, and it
Sure.
would be harder to watch shows. But since I've left and kind of mellowed in my old age, like it just I find that yeah, when a show is able to create that kind of foundation of at least some realism and then build off of that, it's enjoyable, right? So I have a much a newfound appreciation for the Americans because I do think the whole idea of like KGB
The sleeper
directorate s
agent.
like sleepers, like it's real, I mean, like it exists, and I think that show did a wonderful job of also I think in particular kind of dealing with the psychological and emotional uh
Right.
realities of that work. It was really well done in that respect, so I'm a big fan.
The way the show does it real well for the Cold War, you again are doing in a modern era. And then also the way it shows the relationship between the neighbors, how you're kind of
Yes.
sympathetic for the quote bad
Yeah.
guys as
Yeah.
family men, like their parents, they're raising children.
Right.
And then the FBI agent, you see his quirks and his,
Right.
shortcomings also. So it's like
I
there's
know.
no perfect hero.
You're watching the show and you're like, why do I not want the Russians to get caught? Like I don't
Yeah,
want them
right.
to get caught by Stan Beeman. You're like I like Stan, but I don't want him to win
Right.
necessarily. It's like kind of it's a
Well,
twisted
you do that
thing.
too, because I want to ask you, I don't know if this is just me, but I kind of like Ali Hassan. And
Yeah, you
I don't
should
know.
like him.
I think I'm
Yeah.
supposed to hate him because of his position and his reputation, but he ends up being he loves his family. They're first and foremost. He's doing what he has to do to protect them. He sometimes has to be brutal. We see a lot of interrogation scenes where he is not doing friendly things,
Right.
but he has to because of the position he's in. So was Ali Hassan your attempt to create that sympathetic villain who, in the end, actually, I would say is a hero in some ways?
Yeah. 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 I was. So Ali Hassan is, to my mind, the most complicated character in this
Definitely.
book.
Definitely.
And he was actually the character who was the lead character in the very earliest version of this manuscript in
Oh,
2014. So it was like all Syria focused, and a version of him, he was like kind of the main guy. And I've had a lot of time to think about Ali Hassan and who he is and where he comes from and the kind of person he is. And he was an attempt to create someone who was just like a real person. Like,
was it hard to do that?
no, it wasn't, because I had spent so much time analyzing these people, right, who worked
Mm-hmm.
inside the regime,
Mm-hmm.
um, and who were fully vested in it from a familial and professional standpoint, but who were also pretty like ambivalent about what it was
Mm.
doing to suppress
Yes.
the unrest, and had these kind of deep moral qualms about what they had to do, even as they continue to do these things,
Yeah.
and we're not like necessarily like they weren't making a ton of money, and they weren't living in
Mm.
huge mansions. I mean, like, in the book, he's living in a pretty normal, he's living in a good apartment, but he's living
Yeah.
in a normal apartment. He's kind of a servant of this state that is this twisted, representation of this family, and he's kind of stuck in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
and I think in the book I'm not trying to like let him off the hook from a moral standpoint, because he does do a lot of bad things, but I am trying to paint a picture of somebody who has far less agency than I think we do here,
Hmm.
in the States, when we think about like, well, just what are the different choices I can make about my life and what I do, and how how I do things that I think are good versus bad. Like
Yeah.
we have a lot of freedom to do that here, and someone like him in that kind of system just has far less of it, And
Yeah.
so I was interested in exploring that tension of somebody who has this pretty active inner life, unlike his brother. He has this active inner life of like, these things are bad. I don't want to be doing these things.
Yeah.
And yet I'm kind of stuck. And, that's a real person in Syria. I mean, those were real guys who were in the security services and in the military. And, I wanted to bring that to life because I thought that he represented a type that existed in the Civil War. He was that's a real person, and I wanted that story to be told.
I'm really glad you told that story because, again, a total outsider. Yes, I'm a history teacher, so I love keeping up to date with these things, but I don't really know the inside, the palace intrigue and the players and personalities. So it's very easy for me to think, oh, Syria and the Assad administration, they must all be Restums and Basils who are
Yeah,
scalping people and these tough savages, just and the sarin gas, right? Like, how could everybody be on board with this? But then you drop us Ali Hassan and also Dahoud, Uncle Dahoud, because
yeah,
he's the one in the end when one of for all the action that you write really well and all the tradecraft and espionage that's on the edge of your seat. I was maybe most on the edge of my seat in that final sequence. And when he gives the note to Mariam and allows her to make the choice, and
yeah, yeah,
there's this unspoken understanding between them. Like, to me, those are the parts of your storytelling that are more enthralling, more gripping, more complex than them killing three of the Syrian guys who were tracking them or being discovered on an SDR. I
yeah,
loved
yeah,
when you did that with the note.
yeah, yeah. I think I've been struck by this in some of my own reading recently of just random novels and other thrillers or whatever you want to call them. Like I do think that psychological tension, man, that can be really powerful in a book.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. I'm like 50 years late to this party, maybe 60 years late to this party. I just read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Have you ever read that book?
No, I haven't, but I read the other one by her. The Lottery, was that her? But anyway, I didn't read that one.
I, I don't know, and I don't read like horror, but
Okay.
in my most recent book that I'm working on now, like there's this kind of big creepy house in Russia that my CA officers are going to, and I was like, well, okay, what are some examples of books where there's like a like a creepy weird house? Because we've all been in like weird houses. They don't have to be haunted, right? But like there are
You're right.
houses that you could go into where you're like, I don't like being here, right? Like I don't like this
Yeah.
place. It feels weird. So like, how does somebody capture that? And in this book, it's pretty short, but there's very little action. There's no gore, really. It's just this sense of psychological tension and dread that overlays the entire thing that makes it like it almost makes it like you want to turn the pages more for that than like you're saying for like shoot 'em up action scenes, like because
Right.
sometimes you kind of know what's going to happen in the action scene, but with that psychological tension, it's actually more. I don't know. I find it to be more like maybe just you don't know what's going to happen, right? So
Right.
there's more interest and intrigue in it because it's uncertain, it's
Choices
contingent, and
because of
and
human
yeah, there's a lot
freedom.
of choices to make. Exactly. So that book was an example of one I've read recently where it's like man, it does such a good job of building this world around, like, and in the sense of like, oh man, like I just have this pit in my stomach as I'm reading it, even though almost nothing is happening because I'm so invested in what this character's going through. And so I think when I was writing those scenes with Miriam or with Sam at the end, you're kind of I'm hoping that the reader is going to be drawn into this world of like, man, this person is just at the edge, even if they're not running around in a car chase or they're not, shooting somebody. Like they're just on the edge of their seat because their whole world is falling apart. How do I capture that?
Right. And two other characters, I don't know if that exact thing happens to, but who are strong forces and strong personalities. And I get the sense that you're doing some sort of parallelism here. How'd you create, and were you mindful about Butena and Proctor? I saw them as almost the same person on different
Oh,
sides
interesting.
with a lot of the same motivations. But one was a good guy, one was a bad guy. And but they were almost doing the same things for the same reasons for their side. That if you were on that side, you'd obviously cheer and want that person there. But like Proctor,
Right.
she's kick-ass. And these tattoos for all of the lost agents who she felt
Yeah.
responsible for and served under. And then the Mossberg, what a cool character. What a cool character.
Yeah. She's a lot of fun. Honestly, like she's probably my favorite character in the book, if I'm being totally honest. She'll be in the next one. She's actually the only character that carries over into the next book.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, because she is one of those characters who you sit down to write a scene with her and she just kind of takes over the page.
Yeah, for sure.
Like she just kind of powers it forward. And I actually wrote about 100 pages of my second manuscript last spring, and it wasn't going very well. I didn't like it. It wasn't working, and I threw it away and just started bringing her back into the story to kind of resurrect it. And so she ends up being, unlike in Damascus Station in this next book, she is one of the top kind of 3 point of view characters. So you really are in her head as deranged as that may be for a lot of the book. And I found that she was particularly interesting because I think she is this person that a lot of us maybe wish we could be sometimes, which is completely unchained from social norms, the procedures and policies of whatever institution we might work for, and you're just kind of like a wild animal. Like I think she is kind of that.
She's the wild card.
She's a wild card, but she's also really good at her job, and she's intuitive about people. And so I just found her character, she's extremely crass. I found she was kind of a spirit animal for me as I wrote the book. She would just kind of, things with her would flow. It's interesting that you mentioned the parallels with Dana, because I haven't thought about it that way, but as you said, I think there's some truth to that this Dana character is kind of like, she's a little bit like Miriam's chief of station, and I think she has a less warm relationship with Miriam than Sam and Proctor do,
true.
Certainly less collegial, but she's kind of this like sort of unchained representation of some aspect of upper crust Syrian society, and someone that I think was, I honestly wrote the Butena character as a little bit more, I think she's an interesting character, but she's a little bit more of a plot device to kind of drive the Miriam story forward and to create connection between the Hassan brothers through Rustam and what Miriam is doing. So it's kind of like, okay, I need this person to exist to do that. But she is right. She's an interesting character in her own right, and one who is, she's we're not in her head, but she seems like sort of fully and maybe obliviously invested in the system around her, which is true, right? There's a lot of Syrians who are like that. in the government in the early years of the war. So she's very much on point to that in that respect.
I guess maybe I compare them too much, being these female mid-level managers in almost a man's club kind of
Yeah, no, and
situation.
that's true.
And she wants to,
That's a good observation. Yeah,
the way she's gung ho to take down Atia and being a pedophile, like that's her life mission. It's not her job, but like that's what she has to do. She's got this like beef with him, but then at the same time, she wants to get Fatima back, and like she wants to toe the party line and get Mariam to
yeah,
do her job the same way Proctor needs Sam to, when she said just collect the intel, run the agent,
yeah,
collect the intel. Like they're both just very straightforward in what they need to get the mission
yes,
accomplished and how they manage people. But
yes.
okay. So this might be a small thing. I've always wondered about the diplomatic pouch. How many movies, TV shows has it come up? Can you tell me what it actually is and how this whole thing works?
So,
Because you mentioned it.
I mean, it's basically State Department mail.
That nobody can touch or open or scan?
Orange pouch. Yeah, they don't. It's not touched or scanned. So you think about like how does the CIA get a bunch of guns into Syria, right? Like to protect the embassy. How do you get a bunch of cash in? Like that kind of stuff comes in the pouch. And I'm actually not entirely sure what system of international rules or regulations sort of undergird this, but it's generally accepted that there are sort of diplomatic correspondence that is going to go in and out of countries that you're not going to touch. It's going to go to the embassy. We do the same thing, like, the Russians, the Chinese, whatever, will send stuff here via the pouch, and we don't check it. It's kind of generally, accepted that whatever is in there, and all's fair. So
is it just
it's
a
little bit of
agreement, or is that codified?
Oh yeah, that's what I actually don't know. I
Okay.
feel embarrassed to say I'm gonna just go out on a limb here and say it's not codified,
Right.
like formally, but that it's widely
We don't do it to
accepted
you.
and has been practiced for a long time.
You don't do it to us, we do it to you, kind of thing.
Because there's obviously nothing stopping, theoretically, anyone from searching the pouch. Like, think about Moscow. Like, if we're flying something into Moscow via our diplomatic, I forget what the name of the service is, but it's like basically the U.S. State Department, like, postal service
Okay.
that's flying something in, bringing it in by truck or plane or whatever. The Russians could stop it. The Chinese could stop it, right? There's nothing we can do about it. But they know that it's reciprocal and that we'll shut it down too, and everyone kind of has an interest in letting it go. So
maybe more of a political statement to inspect it than it would be to actually try to catch something.
Yeah, and it is a real thing. So
interesting. Speaking about real things, and I don't know how this one got past the review board. You might know where I'm going. The hot dog vending machine? I heard it's real.
No, it's very real. It's very real. Yeah, or at least it was when I was there. There was a hot dog, and by the way, it is funny in talking about this book over the course of the past 7 months. The single detail that has come up the most has been the hot dog vending machine, because and honestly, from all kinds of people, so podcasts, it's been written up in like reviews and newspapers. Honestly, one of my buddies who read the book when it was like in its first draft, its infancy, I'll never forget like the first question out of his mouth, like when we were getting on the phone to talk about it, because he had finished it. He's like, "Hey, I've got some thoughts. Let's talk." First question out of his mouth, he's like, "Is there really a hot dog vending machine in the basement?" And I think it's one of those wonderful details that is at once like it's so insane that it feels like it should be fake, and yet it somehow like flips to the other side where it's like, well, it's so crazy that he must not be making that up. Like he couldn't possibly, he couldn't, it's like no sane person could ever concoct a detail like that. But it's real. It's in the basement. I have never seen one anywhere else in my entire life.
Right.
at any place I've ever worked or been. But yeah, it was the Langley cafeterias would shut down before dinner. And so if you were an unlucky person who was stuck there writing like a
Yeah.
PDV late at night, and it's like midnight and you hadn't planned to be there and you stole someone's granola bar out of their desk to eat, and the hot dog machine would start to seem like a good idea,
All reliable. Yeah.
around midnight, and you just go down there and get one, and cross your fingers on your cholesterol levels later. But it's a real thing.
That's too funny. Yeah, I had to ask you. Hey, so as we start winding down, I want to just ask you a few more general questions, but you did mention the next book, and very
Yeah.
interesting to learn Proctor's perspective will carry on. I'm almost in some way, as much as I loved all the characters and was kind of relieved at the end to hear it was sort of a cliffhanger that they got messages to one another so they know they're alive. Kind
Yeah.
of wondering, will they ever meet up? And then even Ali Hassan getting promoted, knowing he's high up in the administration. I feel like there's a second chapter there, but it's also nice to know that that tale is complete. Like whatever happens
Mm.
next can exist in my imagination, and it's not going to demand of you to tell me what happens next. Like it's kind of nice to know that. But so, could you give any other hints on where we're headed? Like, is Syria done? Is that done and dusted? Are we moving to another hot zone, or where are we going?
So the next book is Russia,
Okay.
and it's modern day Russia. So it's
Okay.
Putin's Russia. It is the Russia of 2023.
Oh wow. Okay.
Which is when the book will come out. Which has been a little hard to do because no one has any idea what's going to happen 2 weeks from
It's
now.
up in the
So I'm
air.
trying to sort
Yeah.
of deal with what is this going to look like.
Oof. That's
Um,
tough.
but I it's been really challenging, but also really fun to dive into a totally new topic. I mean, I didn't cover Russia at the agency. It's not a place where I served, and so I have spent a lot of time researching and spending time with people who have spent a lot of time there to get it right. So the next chapter is Russia. It's in the same universe as Damascus Station, but it's
Mhm.
not. It's not a sequel, obviously, and it's really about what would it look like if the CIA got really serious about making Putin feel uncomfortable with his position. And so
Mm.
it's sort of getting into that's sort of kind of the geopolitical setting, I guess. And then obviously there's a lot of character work in this case, a lot of characters who are under commercial cover. They're Knox.
Mm.
So they're not typical case officers who are working out of an embassy. They're under commercial cover. One is a lawyer. One is actually a thoroughbred horse breeder and owner. And it's been a lot. It has been a really hard book to write, but it's been fun to dig into this world and to create it. And I'm really excited for how it's turning out. I think to your point on Syria, I don't think that story is done. I'm hopeful that at some point in the next 3 to 5 years,
Okay.
I have the opportunity to kind of come back and tell another chapter of that story. I
Okay.
had
Great.
initially I had initially thought of it as like three Syria books, one that's the early part of the war, one that's the middle, and one that's the end. I'm now thinking it's probably just two. So there's probably like one at the beginning and one at the end of the war. I mean, the war is not over, but one that's sort of closer to like, when the
Right.
war started to turn into a stalemate and all the lines froze and all that. So I think there's another chapter there, and I'm hopeful that I'll be able to tell it, but it's not. And I have an outline of something
Okay.
and kind of an idea, an image in my head of how it ends and where
Okay.
characters end up. But I for a whole bunch of different reasons haven't turned to that as my next project.
Okay. I'm glad to hear though the thoughts are there because it gives me
Yeah,
something to think
thoughts
about.
are there.
I must say, I was actually a little shocked. All three of the big bigs survived.
Survived.
Are
Yeah,
are
I was
free,
too actually.
Yeah. it
Yeah.
was refreshing. I wasn't sure if, and it kept me on the edge of my seat. Right, I wasn't sure. Sam, Mariam, Ali Hassan, which ones are going to be alive? Which ones are going to be in a position of power? Which ones are going to have freedom at the end of this book? And that means there's more story left. So that's good to know.
Yeah. Yeah. There's more story left. And I think since the early days of the book I've had a sense of like where this whole thing I write in a process of I have an image in my head of like a scene or a place I want to get to in the book that's oftentimes pretty simple. In the Syria book, it was the interrogation room scene, right?
Mm,
Like, or at least the outlines of that. It's like I knew I wanted to get there even before I had all the plot worked out. So like, how do I get there? And the Russia book, there's a similar kind of climactic scene where I just had an image in my head of this
mm,
house burning and woman riding off on a horse, and it was like, okay, well, how do I get to that place
mm.
and make it work in the book? And so I have that image in my head for the next Syria book, but I have no idea
Okay.
how I'm actually going to get there. But that's the fun of it, is figuring out how do you draw the characters and the plot to kind of get to that
Right.
payoff scene or moment where it all makes sense.
And geopolitical wise, we are in another phase where it's not the
Yeah.
red line of the Obama administration and the sarin gas, and the American involvement in the air is a possibility on the table. It's a very different
Right.
kind of almost slow burn, you might say. I would imagine now, being so far removed from the actual destruction and the threat of international intervention, and now it's the internal fallout is still ongoing, but I feel like it's less center stage from the world. It's a different
Yeah.
kind of
Oh,
conflict than 2011, 13. Yeah.
100%, 100%. And that, I think the kind of books that I like to write really do attempt to deal realistically with like the geopolitical
Right.
setting as much as I can. And so the final chapter of the Syria sort of story, I guess, if it ends up being written, will try to deal really realistically with what's going on in Syria in, let's call it, 2019, 2020, something like that, sort of the last days of the Syrian civil war, or whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
and meet our characters there and then see how they sort of respond to that,
The Russia one, though, is going to be a tall tale to keep up with geopolitics.
I think.
Are you prepared to completely, or would you plan to change things if there's a major event, whether it be something involving the Ukraine crisis or something involving the Putin administration? If there's a major shift in the world, would you feel compelled to do that in your book and deal with it? Or are you going to tell the story at what point your story's at, regardless of world events? Like, I'm seeing reports about Putin's health. Like, who knows?
Yeah, yeah.
2023 might be very different than 2022.
It's funny because um the book essentially deals with the idea of a CIA sort of instigated plot to make Putin feel like a coup is underway without a coup actually being underway,
Mm,
and to you know just sort of capitalize on him feeling against the ropes, and the Russians they're killing each other, and they'd have no reason
dangerous
to.
game.
So dangerous game, but in my book, Putin is kind of the Putin of today, where he's sort of a not a well man, let's say,
Mm,
and an old man, and I think I am cognizant that something could change, over the next year, and I think if it does, what I will probably do is just write the book as sort of the last days of the Putin
mm,
regime or something like that, and then spin, like I do in Damascus Station, a bit of a alternative take on a
mm.
historical period.
Wow, that's good.
Um, so because I can't keep up with the day to day stuff in a
No,
novel.
no,
It
no.
just doesn't work that
Right.
way.
It's got to be
So
your
I
universe at some point. Yeah.
yeah, it's got to be my universe, and so I think it's gonna, regardless. Look, I've already had to do a decent amount of stuff to the book because of
Sure.
Ukraine
Sure.
to capture that. But if Putin ends up going down or Russia changes considerably, that'll get taken into account to some degree. But I think it's still going to be set in the last days of the Vladimir Putin, sort of administration, and I'll just kind of let that be what it is, and my characters exist in that world, So for good or for ill.
Since you read Mitch Rapp, do you recall Red War? I think it was 3-4 books ago. That one deals with similar things of a Russian president and oligarchs who are fomenting some dissent.
I don't know if I've read that one.
It's
is it?
Right
Is it good?
before Lethal Agent.
Okay.
It was probably 2017, 18.
Okay.
It tests NATO's resolve to activate Article 5. It has Krupin is the president who has brain cancer. And so what happens when Krupin has brain cancer and the oligarchs around him are starting to chit-chat? Maybe revisit Red War by Kyle Mills, because a lot of that stuff and a lot of Ukraine parallels. Obviously, he's writing it a number of years ago, but yeah, you might enjoy that one.
I'll check that out, because my book is dealing with, Putin is not explicitly ill in my book, nor is anyone trying to explicitly push him out, but he's kind of like in the backdrop, and there's a lot of angst between the characters that are more in the foreground, of like there's a lot of jockeying going on, and guys who are dealing with old vendettas against each other, and pushing each other around and robbing each other and things like that, because kind of the main guy is like, not weighing in, or his weight in on the side of one of the more powerful ones. So I've got similar dynamics going on in my book. But Red War, okay, I'll need to read that one. I don't think I definitely have not read that one.
All right, I think you'll enjoy it. We got another Mitch Rapp book we've pushed on this podcast. So, David, thanks for joining us. This was a blast. I thoroughly enjoyed your book. Everyone who's still listening has also read it, so hope you guys are sufficiently teased for 2023 and book number 2. Thanks for talking about it. Thanks for coming on, and really, really glad you wrote this book. It was a fantastic story, and I think one that really pushes the genre, thriller genre, espionage, spy novel genre, pushes it to another level in a new direction. So thanks for writing it, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Ton of fun. Really appreciate being here.